I'm just going to dive in, but I think this idea of girls being able to be whatever they want and all the things they want to be is a wonderful segue into my talk, which is about what it's like when a girl becomes a middle-aged woman. So my talk, To Hell and Back, Translating the Inferno into a Narrative Video Game. Just going to go right ahead. So this is based on I just graduated from the MFA in Game Design at NYU, where my thesis game is a game called Via. It's a 2D narrative game about a woman's descent through the 9 levels of midlife hell, and it's inspired by Dante's Inferno. And I'll say a little more about the Inferno in a moment and about what my game is specifically. Its tools are Unity, custom dialogue, scripts, Yarn Spinner, and Procreate. This is the background image is Botticelli's illustration of the levels of Dante's Inferno. And this is Via, the main protagonist of my game. I'll go back there, she is. So why did I make this game? So first of all, I'm a middle-aged woman. In Dante's Inferno, middle age is 35. I think that's very sweet. I'm not 35. I'm older than that. And I don't quite think 35 is middle age, but we can debate this in the Q&A. As in other sectors of public life, middle-aged women are marginalized by, underrepresented in, and also erased from video games and games culture and the games job market in general. And I'm talking specifically about games, but we see this, I think, in other parts of public cultural spaces. This is Returnal's Celine. Returnal's a game made by Housemarque. She's an exception. That's also my favorite game, and I'm happy to talk about it more after this event. And she's one of the exceptions. She's very explicitly a middle-aged woman in the game, but I don't think she should be an exception. And so I feature her here. She's sort of one of the inspirations for my game as well, even though this is a third-person bullet hell shooter, so very different from a 2D narrative game. It's been highly influential on my game development practice. So I wanted to make a game about a middle-aged woman that really centers the experiences of being middle-aged and being a woman. And I thought the Inferno would be an interesting approach to it. This is an encounter early in the game between Via and the character Palm, who will be Via's guide through the underworld. And this is based off of the character of Virgil in the Inferno. So why the Inferno? So first of all, a few words about the Inferno. The Inferno was composed in the early 14th century by the Italian poet Dante Alighieri. He wrote it in Italian, which was unusual at the time. It was the vernacular language. Most poetry was being written in Latin. And I think it's one of the great poems about middle age, even though it's not explicitly about being middle-aged. So the Inferno is part of a longer narrative poem called the Divine Comedy, or Divina Commedia, and it's 3 parts. So the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So Inferno, Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. But the Inferno is arguably the most famous, and I think the best of the 3. So there's something to be said about why Hell is more interesting than Purgatory and Heaven. But the Inferno, basically, in the Inferno, there's a fictional character named Dante who descends with the assistance and guidance of Virgil, who's a Roman poet who wrote in Latin. And they descend through these, it's 9 levels, but it actually ends up being more, of hell. And each level corresponds to a sin. And in each level, Dante has lots of conversations with the damned souls who inhabit these different levels. So you have like shame and lust. So I use that as a kind of inspiration for my game, but I'm not interested in exploring sin. I'm interested in exploring different states of middle age. So my levels, which are still in development, are things like shame, imposter syndrome, aging, my critique of the wellness industry that tries to sell me creams to look less old. So this is how Via will navigate her experience of middle age as a hellscape. So Via participates, in my view, in this expansive tradition of rewriting and reimagining and retranslating the Inferno. I've read a lot of different translations, most of them in English, but one of the things that's always interested me as someone who also does literary translation is how every translation bears the creative imprint of the translator. And every translation exists in its time and place and historical context, but it also embodies what a language is in a particular time and place and context. So I want to just talk quickly about 3 translation kind of approaches, but also translations that have influenced my thinking about VIA and the way I'm writing VIA. So the first is like what I think of as like kind of more standard literary translation. And for this, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1867 translation is one of my favorites. It was one of the first US translations of the Divine Comedy, which I think is interesting to think about why US English in 1867 would have read differently than, say, English in the UK. For a reader of English. And one of the things that Longfellow did that I really liked is he didn't bother with rhyme, and I actually really love that as someone who struggles with rhyme myself in writing poetry. He wrote it in what's called blank verse and in iambic pentameter, which was the dominant meter for US poetry in this period, and still is the meter that people will fall back on when they want things to sound more formal. So also as a male translator, I interweave some of his translation at the beginning because I also want to play around with this shift from a male translator to suddenly then I bring in my voice as the middle-aged woman translator. I'm also interested in where translations fit in terms of history. So Caroline Bergvall's poem Via, so of course there's a connection there between my title and this poem, collates multiple English translations of specifically the opening tercet. And a tercet is a 3-line stanza for those of you who are less familiar with poetry mechanics. And she collates like up to 50, but it's been an ongoing project. And one of the things I love about this project is as you read it, you can see how translators start to influence each other. They'll start to fall back on certain words that reappear. And then I love when some translator tries to go rogue and introduce some whole new word, which sometimes will like push people to start doing things a little differently. So I know it's a little hard to read here, but you can find this poem online and it's really fascinating. But this is the first stanza, which I'll come back to, is the one that really introduces this idea of the Inferno as opening in sort of middle age. At the crossroads of middle age. And then there's like creative translation, which I can think of very expansively. So for me, an example is Alice Notley's poetry book, The Descent of Alet, which is technically directly inspired by The Descent of Inanna, which is a Sumerian poem. But when I read it, I was also thinking there's definitely Dante's Inferno going on here. And The Descent of Alet is the chronicle in poetic form of Alet's journey through the subway tunnels of what is basically New York City, but I don't think is explicitly named, seeking to destroy a character named the Tyrant. So definitely when at some point in my game development, I will have a sort of boss battle where Via is battling a tyrant character. One of the things I was thinking about, so there's a lot of writing in the narrative game, and I wanted to think about translation in sort of 3 different ways. And this is just where I am right now, having done just 2 levels of what will be eventually a 9-level game. So thinking about translation as narrative, translation as a theme, and translation as a figure. So translation as narrative is where I think of like where explicitly translation is part of the storytelling and of the game writing. And one way it comes into play is through intertextuality. So here, like the interweaving of Longfellow's translation into my game writing and into, in the opening level, Via's sort of interior monologue, which is then revealed to the player. So the game opens with the line, "Midway upon the journey of my life, I found myself within a forest dark." And that is the opening lines of Longfellow's translation, but I adapted our life into my life in order to start kind of making the text a little more personal and tied to the character. Then here, okay, now I'm going to try to do video and, oh my gosh. Okay, wait, no, it didn't, wait. I need full screen, sorry. Okay. Yeah, okay. So I am going to be short on time, so I'm going to just try to move through this. The other way is kind of through this translation mechanic. So what you're seeing here, and after going to the branching dialogues talk, I'm a little self-conscious about choices here with translation. But one thing I want to play around, and this is more of a prototype, is that you have this choice, not throughout the whole game, because that would be annoying, but sometimes to choose different types of translation to decode when Palm is speaking to you in Latin or other characters are speaking to you in other languages. So this is an example where like you have this choice of translation and mistranslation, and they would be kind of consequential in terms of how certain dialogues that open up later or certain memory objects that you collect, but also inconsequential in that you can still get to the end of the game and it'll have one ending depending on it. So it's more like a playful thing at the moment. But again, something I'm going to keep thinking about because I think it's interesting to play around with these different approaches to translation within the game. Okay, can you get me back into, thank you so much. Okay, and then quickly, so then also you have translation as a theme. So a big part of this game is translation is both moving through these different levels, but also as Via comes to a greater awareness of who she is as a person after years of wearing skins for other people or as other people. I see that as this transformative process is also kind of how translation works thematically. And that's a scene from the end where she sort of is acknowledging that she played the role of the angel in her previous life, and now she is embracing her demon side. And then finally, translation as a figure. So figure here is thinking of language figuratively. So you can think of it in terms of metaphor. So the descent is a metaphor. But since I haven't done a lot of the descent levels, I can't really show you that. But figure is also character. So we have the character of Via is a sort of figure for translation. So just finally, the first stanza of the Inferno opens with this stanza in Italian, which for the sake of time, I won't read out loud. In Longfellow's translation, midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. This is a picture of Villa, Nevada, which is a ghost town. And it's a place that's, I love ghost towns. And I was thinking about, when I was thinking about the name for the game, I wanted it to be Via, but I didn't want to copy Caroline Bergvall. And I also wanted something that felt more like a name and less like an adverb. And I found this place online. And I was thinking how like throughout the Inferno, Dante's talking to shades and ghosts. And Via also, as she descends through midlife hell, encounters a lot of ghosts, figures from her past, figures from a past that isn't even hers sometimes. But also as she unloads all these skins that she's been wearing and that have weighed her down, that's why she has a big heavy coat. It's like an embodiment of those skins. She is starting to feel like a ghost herself. And so that is also kind of how Via is embodying the process of translation. So as she unloads all these different skins, she starts to get approach and find a way towards her true original self. And so I end on this quote by Anne Carson, who's one of my favorite poets and translators, which not only describes how I see translation, but how I see the translational journey of Via. And I'll finish with reading it. So with translation, you come to a place where you're standing at the edge of the word and you can see across the gap to the other word, the word you're trying to translate, and you can't get there. And something there is learned about human possibilities in that space. And so for me, the game is Via traversing and translating through that void of the self, trying to get at the end to a version of herself that is more true, more real, and more present. Thank you. Oh, gosh. I mean, I have my thesis demo if someone wants, if you're interested, and I'm happy to give you access to that. Yeah. So if anybody wants that, just kind of find me. Yeah.
For me right now, we're working on like a very tiny demo, hopefully to be finished by next year, February-ish, Steam Next Fest time. So that's the goal.
You're both sort of working on games where you're translating something that's like in your life, a lived experience to what is eventually going to be a video game. What do you think are the most important aspects that you want to include from that very sort of like deeply emotional thing that you are plumbing for, you know, whatever sort of feeling that is,
Yeah.
for the like player to experience. Like,
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's hard, right? Like I've been having a lot of conversations with my collaborator and like thoughts about like things that I think are a given in the thing. Like, why do I love Princess Maker? And like, how do I take those things instead of just like including the framework that is a given and like assuming that the feelings will come from the framework. So I'm just like paying extra care to of the way to preserve the feelings while still making it my own and not just relying on everything that the creators have done in the past.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I'm just going to quickly answer. I mean, for me, I mentioned the wellness industry. I get a lot of ads on Instagram for like creams and supplements and all these things that are supposed to make me look less old. But at the same time, there's like this messaging around growing old gracefully. And I want to make a game that's like, goes into the uncomfortable feelings about aging and middle age from a woman's perspective. And I think you've heard me say this before. I really want to make a game that externalizes the rage and resentment that is also, I think, part of that process. And I think that is that is personal for me. And I'm not embarrassed to admit that. I think it's actually important to admit it, that it can suck, and I want to make a game that just relentlessly delivers that message from beginning to end. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that Princess Maker has been demographic to female demographic. Is that part of the reason why they're bringing back the cube as a mascot? Like, I never really understood how they brought it back.
Yeah, for that, I mean, I think there's a lot of answers to that. I mean, for those of you who are not aware, I think I showed an image in the content warning slide. There was like the kind of demon man. He was your butler in Princess Maker 2 and in 4 and 5 and the upcoming game. But he was also the butler in the anime adaptation, and that ended up being very popular more in like the Western world. So I think it was a combination of like the character being popular with fans, the character being popular in like newer demographics that they brought him back. Princess Maker 3 is the only one where Cube is not the butler. They brought on a different character and they just weren't very popular.
I think you were first. I don't know who was first.
Oh, yeah,
We
I
have
don't
3 questions.
Oh, wow. Didn't look-
Steele, did you see who?
No, but we can just go in order of
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. That's
Yeah,
okay.
okay.
So, first of all, hi, I'm a middle-aged medievalist, so like, I'm attracting your target audience. I think this is great. And I'd like you to talk more about the relationship with the guide. I'm really curious about how you're adapting Virgil into this new context. Like, you showed the translation and this translation, which is very cool. What other, how else are you adapting Virgil for this new purpose?
Yeah, so I think in the Inferno, Virgil is often sort of like trying to get Dante to keep moving, just pulling him away from all these conversations. And so, first of all, Palm is inspired by Alice Notley, and as the game progresses, becomes more Alice Notley-ish. So that's my poet in the game, but is also an important interlocutor. So isn't just like there to sort of move things along, but sometimes actually have these conversations where she tries to, like Via hides behind a lot of poetic language. That's part of her mask, and Palm will sort of nudge her to be more honest and direct and straightforward, and will like kind of puncture like through that veil of linguistic sort of facade. So I think in that way, just trying to do a little more with that character is something that I'm interested in.
So you said translation in the context of your designers and artists, and who are translating older works, your work. How do players affect that? Like, how do players in your game? How do I affect the process of translation? Where do I fit into the translation of Steve or figure? Like, how does having a player affect the equation?
Oh, that's a great question. And that's, yeah, I think that is something that I'm still sort of I want the translation mechanic to feel more active in that way. So right now it's like, using Yarn Spinner, it's like I have this choice thing, which is like not really that satisfying. So part of the challenge as I keep working on this game is to find sort of like mechanical solutions that make the translation feel like you're part of the process as a player. But also, I mean, just like, I think also the movement is part of that too. And so part of it is like, it'd be interesting to sort of start incorporating, as you make the player more comfortable with the idea of translation, opportunities for a player to engage with translation itself. But that part is just still in my head. But yeah, thank you.
It's also a question for Adriana. I wonder, do you think video games represent fiction as a medium? Do you think like they have particular? Do they provide like a space or like are they the right tools for you to explore translation? Or like, why do you choose this?
To explore what?
Translation.
Oh. Yeah. Yes, because I mean, I've spent a lot of time. My background is I'm an academic and literary scholar, and I did a lot of literary translation, mostly poetry from Hebrew and Spanish into English. And all of that has been just sort of like working with just very straightforward, you know, you have words in one language and you're now trying to find words in another language for it. But at some point professionally, I was starting to feel like that wasn't kind of enough for me anymore. I wanted to sort of explode the idea of translation, even push it out of the linguistic, which had been my comfort zone. So I think for me, making a game is just, it is a process of translation. It can be. But for me, it's very new and it's letting me do different things with translation. I can also now incorporate the artwork as part of the translation process. I mean, I didn't really get into this, but I'm hand drawing the whole thing. And I only really learned how to draw 2 years ago when I started this program. So it's been also interesting to me how the drawing is also part of that process. There's a lot of thinking about not just translation, but like the narrative itself through the kind of storytelling that happens visually in the game. Yeah.
Some questions for Alex. I was really struck by your example of Fire Emblem Three Kingdoms. This is definitely how high school teachers should not behave towards their pupils. And I was curious how you were exploring that kind of double identification with the person with power over the person who was like you, as well as being that person.
Yeah, well, I mean, my simple solution was to remove the person in power, but I do think there are ways to keep them and explore like the bit of discomfort that happens there. Fire Emblem does it to varying success, right? They like have the time jump, they have whatever, but I think what's important to me is that I'm not advocating for like that to never happen, and I'm really interested in people who are trying to figure out a way for that to make sense for them and for that to be fun for them and for that to be something that they can like hold on to. So yeah, I personally have taken I guess like taking language from our previous talk, the coward's path of taking the power structure away. But there are like so many solutions that I mean, if you have more thoughts, I would love to keep talking about it.
This is for Alex. I was really drawn to what you're talking about with the. I want to be able to like win a fighting tournament and then work a salon and like some random thing for the next few years. And I was drawn to it because of this like Western colonial imposed like idea of productivity and success that I feel like we all kind of fall into. And I was curious if you had more thoughts on how we can teach people to like unlearn those kinds of systems through games, and if you're going to explore that in your upcoming.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what I think is so cool about Princess Maker games and like other games inspired by it is that like technically, especially in the older ones, you are assigned a score or like certain endings are considered better than others. But a lot of the times trying to get an ending like Farmer can be harder than trying to become like the princess, just because of like the balance of the stats you have to achieve. And I think even if that doesn't hit as the message as a child trying to do it, I just think that's one of the ways, by like introducing complications and like by making the system so that like the best ending isn't the hardest one to achieve. Those are some ways to kind of start doing that a little bit. And I'm definitely interested in doing that with my project as well.
All right, this will be the last in-person question we'll take, and then we have some on Discord I'll switch to after. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, this question for both of you, and it's very much tied to the translation and the fact that you're both working with, extending these previous games and works of literature into these new forms. And so I'm also wondering about, in terms of how both of you are approaching work, also thinking about, I mean, I can imagine Alex, right, someone might play the game you're working on when it's finished, having never played a Princess Maker and having this be their like first exposure to this whole system, right? And the same with Adriana. I can imagine someone playing this and going like, oh, I've never heard of the Inferno. This is neat. So in both cases, I'm just curious how you're thinking about the ways in which you're translating and mediating and sort of extending the lives of these previous works, potentially to people who don't even have the context of everything that you're drawing.
Yeah. I don't feel like the game needs to sort of tutorialize the player into some sort of understanding of the Inferno and what I'm doing. I think that for me, it just starts. Like when the game, you're just plunged right into it. Like Via's saying, midway upon the journey of my life. And it's like, okay, like you just start to get a sense. I think part of it is because the language, I think, is so specific and vivid. And then you have this visual environment that's also translating it for the player, that I'm not that worried about it. And I think that actually part of what I love about just that approach is that you do let the player kind of figure some things out on their own. And then if someone wants to do that sort of background reading, like the Hildegard von Bingen quote, like, okay, they can go and find out who's Hildegard von Bingen. I mean, but I don't feel like I need to I don't need to sort of footnote all of that information, because then it just becomes very pedantic. It's like, it becomes a game about like the whole cultural life of, and the context of the game, and less about what I want the game to be, which is how a middle-aged woman is grappling with that experience.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because to be honest, like that idea really excites me. Like the fact that someone who doesn't know Princess Maker might play my game, but at the same time, that consideration isn't really foremost for me at the moment, just because in the way that we're all making games for like me, like yourself, and I can't extricate Princess Maker from my identity. And so honestly, I'm just really looking forward to hearing from people who play the game or the demo and like don't know very much about the genre at all, and just being surprised by those responses.
All right, and for our final question, this comes from Matt on Discord for Via, where they ask, are there sections that you wrote yourself, and how did you think about the act of translation inform those sections, even if they weren't themselves translated from an existing text?
Oh no, most of it is my own writing. So that's the thing that happens. So when it opens, I think like maybe the first 10 lines are drawing pretty heavily from the Longfellow, but then I think of it as like starting to phase it out and then phase my voice, which is Via's voice, in. And then from there, it's like there'll be quotations from things, but the writing will be mine for the most. But to the extent that writing, what is my writing? It's like everything is sort of drawing from other sources. But yeah, I'm not translating or retranslating the Inferno, the entire thing. It's mostly, that influence is mostly kind of the level design, more than anything else. Yeah.
Thank you.